Climate change is perhaps the biggest challenge facing our lives today. The natural world that supports us in so many ways is in peril, and there is an urgent need for us to do all we can to reverse its decline. The transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy is key to this, and harnessing the power of wind to generate that energy is an essential part of our solution. The North Sea, with its strong and reliable winds and shallow waters, offers the perfect conditions for the expansion of offshore wind power. But the North Sea brings us so much more.
The North Sea is home for lots of nature. You have incredible diversity of wildlife that you find in the North Sea, from seabirds to marine mammals to fish to invertebrate species.
The North Sea is not just a bowl of water, but it's full of life. It's very interesting. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot to protect and a lot to be happy about.
Well, the North Sea is really it's an amazing place with all those sort of seabird colonies on there, incredibly rich, incredibly vibrant. You have all those noise, those smells, and really you can't experience them anywhere else around the UK and around Europe.
The North Sea is a unique marine environment, alive with biodiversity. It provides a range of different habitats, from shallow bays to deep fjords, sandbanks and rocky shores that support rich marine ecosystems, home to an abundance of fish, shellfish and marine mammals. More than 30 different seabird species inhabit its coasts and cliffs, feeding on the riches that its waters provide. And like all seas, it's fundamental to our lives too. It gives us food, supports economic activities, and its coasts and beaches are spaces for us to enjoy in so many different ways. But the North Sea has been heavily overexploited. Overfishing has been a problem for more than 100 years, and still continues. And human activities from oil and gas to aquaculture and shipping all compete for space in what is one of the busiest seas on the planet. And this has already taken its toll on nature.
So the North Sea has always been a very important part of society, going back thousands of years. And yeah, we've really made a lot of money from the sea, and we're now reaching a point where we're taking too much from the sea. We're asking too much of the sea, and it's starting to become a problem for the wildlife that is out there.
Yeah, unfortunately the North Sea is already a pretty degraded ecosystem because of all the different human activities happening there. And the trend isn't really reversing itself. We see many different species in decline, and the North Sea can't cope with all these pressures anymore.
And healthy marine ecosystems don't just support biodiversity. They are also a key ally in the fight against climate change, as they capture and lock away carbon. But as our seas degrade, their ability to continue to provide this vital service also diminishes. So it is crucial that as we build and operate our renewable energy systems to address the climate crisis, that we also consider carefully the impact of those activities on the natural world that we are, in fact, trying to protect.
There is definitely a need for offshore wind expansion in the North Sea, across the UK, across Europe. We need to reach net zero by 2050, by 2045 really, if we are to stand a chance to sort of minimise the impact of the climate crisis. However, we can't get this wrong. We need the offshore wind to be thought out so it's put in places that will impact nature in the least way possible.
We absolutely need to press ahead with tackling climate change and cleaning up our power systems, not only from a carbon and climate perspective, but also for energy security. We've just got to make sure we do it right, and we do it in a way that provides the right response to the biodiversity crisis as well as climate.
And that is the challenge. There are significant plans for the expansion of offshore wind in the North Sea to meet these climate goals. Capacity is set to more than triple between 2023 and 2030 and increase tenfold by 2050.
There is risks with this expansion if it's not planned properly. There is risks typically for our seabirds, the most obvious risk being, of course, collision, which is the one that we probably speak about the most. But there's also a lot of other sort of less direct impacts that can be caused. So typically by placing wind farms in between their routes from nesting to feeding, which means that they would have to increase their feeding rounds, leaving the chicks at the nest for longer than expected and increasing potentially the risks of mortality here.
And it's not just the impact of the turbines themselves that needs to be considered. There is significant infrastructure needed to connect these systems to our electricity grid.
A grid connects the renewable generation to industry and consumers. Therefore, if we think about the infrastructure, we need to think also about subsea cables, converter stations, landing point, because renewables and grid needs to be considered together. They are both part of the same solution.
Whether it is the location of the turbines or the infrastructure to support them, selecting the most suitable place to build an offshore wind farm is critical to avoid conflict with nature, or at least minimize it.
So this really comes down to spatial planning of your offshore wind. So the best way to minimize harm to nature from offshore wind is to avoid impacts in the first place. And this means placing your wind farms in the best possible locations at sea, which means avoiding those areas that are really important for nature, that contain species and habitats that are sensitive to negative impacts, and locating your wind farms in areas where the negative impacts will be less.
The process for selecting a location varies country by country, but ultimately, decisions are taken by the nation-state. So there is a huge responsibility on the shoulders of governments to get this right. But regardless of where a wind farm is built, some impact on nature may be unavoidable. That's why avoidance is just the first step in what ecologists call the mitigation hierarchy.
The mitigation hierarchy starts on the one hand with avoidance. So for example, if I want to make an offshore wind farm, if I want to put it somewhere in the marine area, I'm going to find a place that has the least effects on nature. And then the next step, if I'm going to build my wind farm there, is to mitigate effects. So for example, I'm going to pile drive my turbines into the seafloor, which makes noise. But maybe I can lower that noise a little bit by placing bubble curtains. So we're mitigating the effect. But there's still an effect. And what you want to do then is look beyond mitigation towards compensation and restoration.
It's the statutory bodies, the national bodies that decide the areas, and increasingly they're also deciding the very specific footprint of each individual wind farm. Once we have a site, we have a lot that we can do in terms of following the mitigation hierarchy in a way that delivers minimum impacts and addresses the impacts that remain.
There are many mitigation measures wind farm operators can put in place to reduce their impact on the environment. And that starts at the design stage. This may include changes to the layout of the turbines or changes to their height or configuration. And then comes the construction phase, and that in itself is a massive maritime operation with fairly well-known effects on the seabed and the creatures that live around it.
In the construction phase, noise is probably the main challenge here. Noise comes mainly from drilling and hammering operations in the seabed, but it could also come as well by the amount of vessels that will come and go to the site. We have to reduce the impacts by selecting the best time of the year to perform the operations where there's less animals in the area, but also we deliver improved processes like a soft start in the drilling operations that will allow the animals to leave the area before the noise increases. But also in very sensitive areas, we deliver physical noise reduction features like bubble curtains.
So a bubble curtain essentially creates, if you like, a donut around where we're installing the foundation, and it releases a string of air bubbles around that donut, and it creates a curtain of air bubbles which provide acoustic damping, so the noise that's created while we're putting in the foundation is somewhat reduced for anything that's outside that bubble curtain.
Once the wind farm is up and running, the impacts of the construction phase may be over, but there are continuing effects throughout the lifetime of its operation.
Those wind farms are incredibly significant. They're big, they are the size of the Eiffel Tower. So you can imagine that something this size is going to cause some disturbance when it's being created, but also throughout its life cycle.
Modern offshore wind turbines are indeed giants. The largest can reach more than 250 metres in height, with blade spans exceeding 200 metres, and can generate enough electricity to power over 10,000 homes. Some wind farms contain more than 100 turbines and cover areas of more than 100 square kilometres. That's about the size of 10,000 football pitches.
We're talking about the operation phase of a wind farm here. The most challenging aspect would be birds. And for this, probably the most critical stage would be the design phase of the wind farm, the selection of sites, and also the selection, for example, of the height of the wind turbines. We need to bring along more technological innovations to detect and prevent birds from colliding with the wind turbines. Here, a good example, a promising technology would be the use of radar together with cameras to provide an early detection of incoming birds and deliver the appropriate operating instructions.
In some cases, despite careful sighting and mitigation of adverse effects on the natural environment, impacts may remain. And this leads to the final stage in the mitigation hierarchy, the idea of compensation.
So the idea of compensation is that you're trying to compensate for something that you've done that you have not been able to mitigate effectively. So it's seen as the end of the hierarchy. And there are examples now, there's a good one at the moment, where the seabird, the kittiwake, is very much vulnerable in terms of its breeding environment. So they've actually put, for want of a better word, 2 kittiwake hotels where they created these opportunities for the kittiwakes to go and nest. That's not at the wind farm site, but it's a kind of an example of a compensation. What we need to do though is determine, is it effective? Does it work? What's the potential outcome of that?
Because of the scale of offshore wind development, there is still going to be a need to have some of this compensation in some cases, and we do recognize that. So we're working really hard with government and with our scientists and with other organizations to try and find solutions that could work. We really want to be enablers in this space here, but recognizing that the key is always going to be to avoid and to mitigate for impact in the first place.
Avoidance, mitigation, and compensation. We have to protect our seas and the creatures that live in them as we go through this transformation. They are already in a critical state. And that's why this may be an opportunity to do more than just limit the damage we do. This is an opportunity to go a step further, to take positive action to recover nature.
Within wind farms, we can also do stuff that's positive for nature, and this is referred to as nature-inclusive design. So we can look at making these sites more attractive for some types of nature. So we can do stuff like artificial reefs within the wind farm sites. We can modify the turbines to provide spaces for fish and other invertebrates. It's really all about finding ways that we can make these sites more attractive for nature.
We as a nature organization are working a lot with the wind industry because we have the same goal. But if you want to become nature positive, you need to also include nature inclusive design. And that should be your focus when you're developing a wind farm. You're including nature into your design.
This cooperation between environmental organisations and industry is happening. The Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature, nicely abbreviated to OCEAN, is a coalition of more than 30 NGOs, wind and grid actors across Europe, working together to speed up the rollout of offshore wind, while, at the same time, protecting nature and restoring our seas. And there are also national initiatives, such as the Rich North Sea programme in the Netherlands.
So with the program we also do active restoration or active nature enhancement, where we try to kickstart nature a little bit to push it in the right direction. So for example, in the south of the Netherlands we have the Borssele wind farm area where we have two projects. One is focused on oysters, so flat oyster or native oyster, and we place them on the scour protection of wind farms. And then we go back and check on them and see how they're doing, but it's more than just oysters because they also provide habitat for other species.
The humble oyster is a carbon-absorbing, habitat-creating organism. The oyster is not a single species, it's a species that attracts 400 plus other species to its reefs. It is the ultimate ecosystem engineer.
But action within wind farms has its limits. Some species cannot thrive in wind farms, whatever we do there, and may, in any case, actively avoid these areas. And of course, there is a need to support nature recovery across the whole North Sea, not just within wind farms.
I think the data is coming together very quickly on where to put what, where you put an artificial reef to put in cod or lobster, where the most fertile place to put back oysters might be. I think that's coming together, and it needs to be a three-way thing between government, wind farm operators and the ecologists themselves.
It's also looking where we can have the biggest impact on the broader ecosystem where we're operating, and a good example of this is in the Humber estuary, where we've got a rewilding restoration programme running. That includes putting in 500,000 native oysters. We're also planting seagrass, really important for a number of reasons. It's great for habitat creation, it has high ecosystem services, as we would say, but it also sequesters carbon, something like 4 times as efficiently as terrestrial forest, by the way. And we're also restoring salt marsh. So a really broad programme of restoration. We're doing that to learn how we can best deliver this net positive biodiversity impact.
We need to restore back ecosystems that have been degraded over many, many years of unsustainable development. It's our time to go beyond just protection and getting to restoration of nature.
The renewable energy transition marks a new era for our seas and an opportunity to rethink how we use them. We can develop the renewable energy resources we need to tackle the climate crisis and have healthy, thriving seas. But this will require all users, not just the wind sector, to play their part.
One of the bigger problems that we have is that we don't really know what the impact is on the ecology by the different sectors. So we do know that we're going to put even more pressure on this already fragile ecosystem. So we need to have this holistic view, and not just as separate countries, but as North Sea countries together, and to make a proper marine spatial plan that works, because ecology does not know boundaries.
The way forward will require smart solutions, creating spaces that can be shared by different users, whilst also ensuring a reduction of the overall pressure on our seas. some areas should remain free from all human activities and disturbance to enable nature to recover and thrive. The transition to renewable energy is a wake-up call. It is a challenge for nature, but it's also an opportunity that we simply can't afford to miss. The price of getting it wrong is high, but the rewards of getting it right, for nature and for us, are immeasurable.